Hello everyone, this is Sarah. I am back with another topic, socialism in Europe and the Russian Revolution. One of the group which looked to change society were the liberals. Liberals wanted a nation which tolerated all religions. We should remember that at this time, European states usually discriminated in favor of one religion or another. Britain favored the Church of England, Austria and Spain favored the Catholic Church. Liberals also opposed the uncontrolled power of dynastic rules. They wanted to safeguard the rights of individuals against governments. They argued for a representative, elected parliament government subject to law interrupted by a well-trained judiciary that was independent of rulers and officials. However, they were not Democrats. They did not believe in universal adult franchise, that is, the right of every citizen to vote. They felt men of property mainly should have the vote. They also did not want the vote for women. In contrast, radicals wanted a nation in which government was based on the majority of a country's population. Many supported women's. Unlike liberals, they opposed the privileges to great landowners and wealthy factory owners. They were not against the extent of private property but disliked concentration of property in the hands of a few. Conservatives were opposed to radicals and liberals. After the French Revolution, however, even conservatives had opened their minds to the need of change. Earlier in the 18th century, conservatives had been generally opposed to the ideas of change, but but belief that the past had to be respected and change had to be brought about through a slow process. Such differing ideas about societal change clashed during the social and political turmoil that followed the French Revolution. The various attempts at revolution and national transformation in the 19th century helped define both the limits and potential of these political tendencies. Industrial society and social change. These political trends were signs of a new time. It was a time of profound social and economic changes. It was a time when new cities came up and new industrialized regions developed. Railways expanded and the Industrial Revolution occurred. Industrialization brought men, women, and children to factories. Work hours were often long and wages were poor. Unemployment was common, particularly during times of low demand for industrial goods. Housing and sanitation were problems since towns were growing rapidly. Liberals radicals searched for solutions to these issues. Almost all industries were the property of individuals. Liberals and radicals themselves were often property owners and employers, having made their wealth through trade or industrial ventures. They felt that such effort should be encouraged, that its benefits would be achieved if the workforce in the economy was healthy and citizens were educated, opposed to the privileges the old aristocracy had by birth. They firmly believed in the value of individual effort, labor, and enterprises. A freedom for individual was ensured if the poor could labor and those with capital could operate without restraint. They believed that society would develop. Many working men and women who wanted change in the world rallied around liberal and radical groups and parties in the early 19th century. Some nationalist liberals and radicals wanted revolution to put an end to the kind of governments established in Europe 1815. In France, Italy, Germany, and Russia, they became revolutionaries and worked to overthrow existing monarchy. Nationalists talked of revolutions that would create nations where all citizens would have equal rights. After 1815, an Italian nationalist conspired with others to achieve this in Italy. Nationalists elsewhere, including Indian, read his writings. The coming of socialism to Europe. Perhaps one of the most far reaching visions of how society should be structured was socialism. By the mid 19th century in Europe, socialism was a well known body of ideas and attracted widespread attention. Socialists were against private property and saw it as the root of all social ills of this time. Why? Individuals owned the property that gave employment, but the pro but the proper but the propertied were consumed only the personal gain and not with the welfare of those who made the property productive. So if society as a whole rather than single individuals controlled property, more attention would be paid to collective social interest. Socialists wanted this change and campaigned for it. How could a society without property operate? Would be the basic of socialist society. Socialists had different vision of the future. Some believed in the idea of corporates. Robert Owen, 1771 to 1858, a leading English manufacturer, sought to build a cooperative community called New Harmony in Indian, USA. Other socialists felt that cooperative could not be built on a wide scale, only through individual initiative. They demanded the government encourage cooperative in France. For instance, Louis Blanc, 1813 to 1882, wanted the government to encourage cooperatives and replace capitalist enterprises. These cooperatives were to be association of people who produced goods together and divided the profits according to the work done by members. Karl Marx, 1818 to 1883, and Friedrich Engels, 1820 to 1895, added other ideas to this body of arguments. Marx argued that industrial society was capitalist. Capitalists owned the capital invested in factories, and the profit of capitalists was produced by workers. The conditions of workers could not improve as long as this profit was accumulated by private capitalists. Workers had to overthrow capitalism and the rule of private property. Marx believed that to free themselves from capitalist exploitation, workers had to construct a radically socialist society where all property was socially controlled. This would be a communities society. He was convinced that workers would trump in their conflicts and with socialists. A community society was the natural society of the future. Support for socialism. By the 1870s, socialist ideas spread through Europe. To coordinate their efforts, socialists formed an international body, namely the Secondly International. Workers in England and Germany began forming associations to fight for better living and working conditions. They set up funds to help members in times of distress and demand a reduction of working hours and right to vote. In Germany, these associations worked closely with the Social Democratic Party (SPD) and helped it win parliamentary seats. By 1905, socialists and trade unionists formed a Labour Party in Britain and a Socialist Party in France. However, till 1914, socialists never succeeded in forming a government in Europe, represented by strong figures in parliamentary politics. Their ideas did shape legislations, but governments continued to be run by conservatives, liberals, and radicals. The Russian Revolution. In one of the least industrialized of European states, this situation was reversed. Socialists took over the government in Russia through the October Revolution of 1970. the fall of monarchy in February 1917, and the events of October are normally called the Russian Revolution. How did this come about? What were the social and political conditions in Russia when the revolution occurred? To answer this question, let us look at the Russia a few years back to the revolution. In 1914, Tsar Nicholas ruled Russia and its empire beside the territory around Moscow. The Russian Empire included current-day Finland, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, parts of Poland, Ukraine, and Belarus. It stretched to the Pacific and comprised today's Central Asian states, as well as Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. The majority religion was Russian Orthodox Christianity, which had grown out of the Greek Orthodox Church, but the empire also included Catholics, Protestants, Muslims, and Buddhists. Economy and society. At the beginning of the 20th century, the vast majority of Russia's people were agriculturists. About 85% of the Russian Empire's population earned their living from agriculture. This proportion was higher than in most European countries. For instance, in France and Germany, the proportion was between 40% and 50%. In the empire, cultivators produced for the market as well as for their own needs, and Russia was a major exporter for grain. Industry was found in pockets. Prominent industrial areas were St. Petersburg and Moscow. Craftsmen undertook much of the production, but large factories existed alongside craft workshops. Many factories were set up in the 1890s when Russia's railway network was extended and foreign investment in industrial increased. Coal production doubled and iron and steel output quadrupled. But the 90s, in some areas, factory workers and craftsmen were almost equal in number. Most industries was the private property of industrialist government supervised large factories to ensure minimum wages and limited hours of work, but factory inspectors could not prevent rules being broke. In craft units and small workshops, the working day was sometimes in 15 hours compared with 10 or 12 hours in factories. Accommodation varied from rooms to dormitories. Workers were a divided social group. Some had strong links with the villages from which they came. Others had settled in cities permanently. Workers were divided by skill. A metal worker of St. Petersburg recalled, metal workers considered themselves aristocrats among other works. Their occupation demanded more training and skill. Women made up 31% of factory labor force by 1940, but they were paid less than men, between half and three-quarters of a man's wage. Division among workers showed themselves in dress and manners too. Some workers formed associations to help members in time of unemployment or financial hardship, but such associations were few. Despite divisions, workers did unite to stop work when they disagreed with employees about dismissals or work conditions. These strikes took place frequently in the textile industry during 1896 to 1897 and in the metal industry during 1902. In the countryside, peasants cultivated most of the land, but the nobility, the crown, and the Orthodox Church owned large properties. Like workers, peasants too were divided. They were also deeply, deeply religious, but except in a few cases, they had no respect for the nobility. Nobles got their power and position through their services to the Tsar, not through local popularity. This was unlike France, where during the French Revolution in Brittany, peasants respected nobles and fought for them. In Russia, peasants wanted the land of the nobles to be given to them. Frequently, they refused to pay rent and even murdered landlords. In 1902, this occurred on large scale in South Russia and in 1905 such incident took place all over Russia. Russian peasants were different from the European peasants in another way. They pooled their land together periodically and their committee divided it according to the needs of individual families. Socialism in Russia. All political parties were illegal in Russia before 1914. The Russian Social Democratic Workers' Party was founded in 1898 by socialists who respected Marx's ideas. However, because of government policing, it had to operate as an illegal organization. It set up a newspaper, mobilized workers, and organized strikes. Some Russian socialists felt that Russian peasants' custom of dividing land periodically made them natural socialists. So peasants, not workers, would be the main force of the revolution, and Russia could become socialist more quickly more than countries. Socialists were active in the countryside through the late 19th century. They formed the Socialist Revolutionary Party in 19. This party struggled for peasants' rights and demanded that land belonging to noble be transferred to peasants. Social democrats disagreed with socialist revolutionaries about peasants. Lenin felt that peasants were not one united group. Some were poor and others rich. Some worked as laborers while others were capitalists who employed workers. Given this differentiation within them, they could not be all part of a socialist movement. The party was divided over the strategy of organization. Lenin, who led the Bolshevik group, though that in a repressive society like Tsarist Russia, the party should be disciplined and should control the number and quality of its members. Others, Mensheviks, though that the party should be open to all, as in Germany. A turbulent time, the 1905 revolution. Russia was an autocracy. Unlike other European rulers, even at the beginning of the 20th century, the Tsar was not subject to parliament. Liberals in Russia campaigned to end this state of affairs. Together with the Social Democrats and Socialist revolutionaries, they worked with peasants and workers during the revolution of 1905 to demand a constitution. They were supported in the empire by nationalists. In Poland, for instance, and in Muslim dominated areas by jihadists who wanted modernized Islam to lead their societies. The year 1904 was a particularly bad one of Russian workers. Prices of essential goods rose so quickly that the real wage declined by 20%. The membership of workers' associations rose dramatically when four members of the Assembly of Russian Workers, which had been formed in 1904, were dismissed at the ironworks. There was a call for industrial action. Over the next few days, workers in St. Petersburg went on strike, demanding a reduction in the working day to 8 hours, an increase in wages, and improvement in working conditions. When the processions of workers led by Father Gapon reached the Winter Palace, it was attacked by the police and the Cossacks. Over 100 workers were killed and about 300 wounded. The First World War and the Russian Empire. In 1914 was broke out between two European alliances, Germany, Austria and Turkey, the Central Powers, and France, Britain and Russia. later Italy and Rome. Each country had a global empire, and the war was fought outside Europe as well as in Europe. This was the First World War. In Russia, the war was initially popular and the people railed around Tsar Nicholas as the war continued, though the Tsar refused to consult the main parties in Duma. Support wore thin. Anti-German sentiments ran high. It can In the remaining of Saint Petersburg, a German name as Petrograd, the Tsarian Alexander's German origins and poor advisors, especially a monk called Rasputin, made the autocracy unpopular. The First World War on the Eastern Front differed from that on the Western Front. In the East, armies fought from trenches stretched along eastern France. In the East, armies moved a good deal and fought battles, leaving large casualties. Defeats were shocking and demoralizing. Russia's armies lost badly in Germany and Austria between 1914 and 1916. There were about 7 million casualties by 1917. As they retreated, the Russian army destroyed crops and buildings to prevent the enemy from being able to live off the land. The destruction of crops and building led to over 3 million refugees in Russia. The February Revolution. In the winter of 1970, the conditions in the capital Petrograd were grim. The layout of the society seemed to be emphasized. The division among its people, the workers' quarters and factories, were located on the right bank of the river Neva. On the left bank were the fashionable areas, the Winter Palace and the official buildings, including the palace where the Duma met. In February 1917, food shortage was deeply felt in the workers' quarters. The winter was very cold. There had been exceptional frost and heavy snow. Parliamentaries wishing to preserve elected government were opposed to the Tsar's desire to dissolve the Duma. On 22nd February, a lockout took place at a factory on the right bank. The next day, workers in 50 factories called a strike in sympathy. In many factories, women led the way to strikes. This came to be called the International Women's Day. Demonstrating workers crossed from the factory quarters to the center of the capital, the Nevsky Prospect. At this stage, no political parties was actively organizing the movement, as the fashionable quarters and official buildings were surrounded by workers. The government imposed an curfew. Demonstrates dispersed by the evening out they came back on the 24th and 25th. The government called out the cavalry, the police, and eye on them. On Sunday, 25th February, the government suspended the Duma. Politicians spoke out against the measure. Demonstrators returned in the force to the streets of the left bank on the 26th. On the 27th, the police headquarters were ransacked. The streets thronged with people raising slogans about bread, wages, better hours, and democracy. The government tried to control the situation and called out the cavalry once again. However, the cavalry refused to fire on demonstrators. An officer was shot at the barracks of a regiment, and three other regiments mutinied, voting to join the striking workers. By the evening, soldiers and strike workers had gathered to form a Soviet or council in the same building at the Duma meet. This was Petrograd Soviet. The very next day, a delegation went to see the Tsar. Military commanders advised him to abdicate. He followed their advice and abdicated on 2nd March. Soviet leader, the Duma leader, formed a provisional government to run the country. Russia's further future would be decided by a constitution assembly elected on the basis of universal adult. Petrograd had and Petrograd had led the February Revolution that brought down the monarchy in February 1970. Army officials after February, army officials, landowners, and industrialists were influential in the provisional government, but the liberals as well as socialists among them worked towards an elected government. Restrictions on public meeting and associations were seemed Soviets, like the Petrograd Soviet, were set up everywhere, though no common system of election was followed. In April 1917, the Bolsheviks leader Lenin turned to Russia from his exile. He and the Bolsheviks had opposed the war since 1914. Now he felt it was the time for Soviets to take over power. He declared that the war be brought to a close, land to be transferred and to be peasants, and banks to be nationalized. These three demands were Lenin's. April theses. He also argued that the Bolshevik Party rename itself the Communist Party to indicate its new radical aims. Most others in the Bolshevik Party were initially surprised by the April theses. They thought that the time was not ripe for socialist revolutions. The Bolsheviks were totally opposed to the private property. Most industry and banks were nationalized in November 1917. This meant that the government took over ownership and management. Land was declared social property and peasants were allowed to seize the lands of the nobility. In cities, Bolsheviks enforced the partition of large house according to family requirement. They banned the use of the old titles of aristocracy. To assert the change, new uniforms were designed for the army and officials. Following a clothing competitions organized in 1918, when the Soviet hat was chosen, the Bolshevik Party was renamed the Russian Communist Party. In November 1917, the Bolsheviks conducted the election to the Constitution Assembly, but they failed to gain majority support. In January 1918, the Assembly rejected Bolshevik measures and Lenin dismissed the Assembly. He thought the All-Russian Congress of Soviets was more democratic than an assembly elected in uncertain conditions. In March 1918, despite opposition by their political allies, the Bolsheviks made peace with Germany at Brest-Litovsk. In the years that followed, the Bolsheviks became the only party to participate in the elections to All-Russian Congress of Soviets, which became the parliament of the country. Russia became a one-party state. Trade unions were kept under party control. The secret police called the Cheka first and later OGPU and NKVD punished those who criticized the Bolsheviks. Many young writers and artists rallied to the party because it stood for socialism and for change. After October 1917, this led to the experiments in the arts and architecture. Because of the censorship the party encouraged. Thank you for watching, guys. Please share, subscribe, click the bell icon for the further notifications, and do not forget to like and leave a comment below.